It's my pleasure today to introduce Aaron Clauset from our own computer science department and BioFrontiers. Uh, so, I'm not one for sort of long introductions, but I have a sort of hobbyist interest in, let's say, complex systems and networks. Or I have, ever since I was a student. And so I was very pleased to eventually find out after coming here that Aaron is here. And he's done, I think, a lot of very great work in this field and is a very careful scientist, as we were discussing just recently. So I have a lot of respect for that. And so today, Aaron will tell us about, applications of ideas, thinking about, networks among scientists and understanding questions about, whether physics and academics more generally are meritocratic, and understanding what makes scientists productive. And, I think this is a sort of very intriguing issue for us to think about as a department. And so we're very happy to have him here. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so okay, thanks. Yeah, that'll make the slides a bit more obvious. Okay, so this is not going to be a talk about physics. So thank you all for being willing to venture outside of the nice physics comfort zone into the world of social science and what we call the science of science, in which we're trying to apply scientific principles and approaches and methods to understand how scientific discoveries are made in aggregate. Try to understand the system that we have built in the modern civilization that is kind of amazing that we can be professional scientists, and like our job is to do science. That's awesome. And yet trying to understand how the system works and can we make it better in some sense. So this idea of a meritocracy, the title is meant to be somewhat provocative, but this idea of a meritocracy is really core to the way we're raised and acculturated and socialized to be scientists. Like, we're taught to believe that these meritocratic principles are really valuable and really what drive things forward. But it's a reasonable question to ask, well, how well do we achieve those principles in practice? And so today is going to be an exploration of that in some sense. So let me start off by prodding you a little bit to get you thinking about these questions, by asserting that science is not a meritocracy. In fact, despite our adherence or our aspiration for these principles, that science is not a meritocracy. And I'll argue that point in two ways. The first is that good ideas do not always win out over mediocre ideas. And you may be familiar with some examples that you can think of, but I'll walk you through a few from different fields. One is a recent observation, so this came out last year, that 15 years of Alzheimer's research on A-beta oligomers is basically based on fraud. That the original discovery, the original paper that launched that interest was based on fraudulent data. And so this is something like $1 billion, and thousands of papers have been written in an area in which a mediocre idea won over the meritocratic idea, the excellent idea, which is that there was no signal there to begin with. And so this is an enormous waste of both money and time and arguably careers and human ingenuity, wasted on originally a fabrication of scores in Alzheimer's articles. That's one in biology. Here's one from economics, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which has sort of entered popular parlance, this idea that people who are less intelligent don't realize what they don't know. And it turns out that this is just a statistical artifact from the original paper, that paper was based on a misreading of the statistics that they had collected. And so this effect doesn't exist. In fact, that's one example from economics. Here's one from physics, which you may be familiar with from ages ago, polywater and in-rays. This was from a long time ago, 69 and 1904. It's a very long time ago. But polywater was an amazing example of mediocre ideas winning out over excellent ideas. How many of you are familiar with polywater? A few. Yeah, it's really like in the annals of physics. It was this idea that there was a polymer phase of water, that you could produce under certain conditions. And this lab that claimed to be able to find it, they were the only ones that could make it happen. And so people would send their samples to this lab, and the lab would send them back. And eventually they figured out that it was all contaminants that were creating the polymer. And yet that occupied a lot of time and resources and attention. And so that's another example of a mediocre idea winning out over better ones, because people spent time working on this crud, okay?
There's also all the high temperature
I should change my slides to put that on there, because that, yes, that's an excellent example.
room temperature.
Room temperature superconductors, yeah. Yeah, but think about how many person hours were spent during those 3 weeks to shoot down that idea. Yeah, cold fusion, exactly, right? I mean, if we sit around for 20 minutes, we could come up with, 100 examples of this. And so usually people respond by saying, oh, well, science is self-correcting, right? Like, yes, we figured out the answer after a while, but we only know the instances that we have corrected. What about all the instances in the literature that we haven't gone back and looked at? We haven't spent enough time to tell whether or not those ideas or discoveries actually hold up. I sit on the first level review committee in the College of Engineering, and we had a fun discussion at the beginning of the semester in which we talked about like how much weight should we put on citation counts and publications and so on. And one of the material scientists said, oh yeah, there's a whole subfield in my area that's just like, I don't know what they're doing. Like they all cite each other's papers, but all those ideas are crud. There's nothing in those ideas, and yet they still have citations and publications. So from the metrics, they look, okay. And that was a claim that despite, the productivity, like that was a wasted effort, right? So science was not self-correcting in that case. But we'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so here's some examples from psychology. Some of you may be familiar with the power posing idea, the idea that if you hold yourself in a certain powerful way, that it changes your hormone levels, and then you become powerful. You feel powerful, right? It's a very psychological explanation. The statistics didn't replicate in other experiments, and so this idea also got a lot of attention, changed a lot of careers, and then didn't turn out to hold up. Okay, so I would argue that these things are examples of what you could call epistemic inefficiencies, right? If science is self-correcting, that can be good, but how much wasted effort do we spend correcting the bad science? Could we use less effort to correct the bad science by producing less bad science in the first place, for instance? Okay, so epistemic inefficiencies. If we could make science more efficient, we could make more discoveries, better discoveries, waste less time, for instance. So this is an admirable goal, to make science more efficient. All right, second point. The best scientists are not always recognized for their discoveries. What do I mean by this? Well, here's some examples that sort of fit in with things you may have read about recently. Science is biased, right? So these are two examples, one from the left about bias against women, in which patents by women focus more on women's health, but few women get to invent, right? So this is a whole class of inventions that are not getting made because there are not enough women inventors to make them, because the system doesn't select for them. And then this other paper, I really love this paper. This is the Lost Einsteins paper, done by Raj Chetty's group at Harvard. He does amazing stuff with administrative data. He looked at the tendency to become inventors relative to exposure to inventors as a child. And so who gets exposed to inventors? Exposed meaning like socially exposed to them. Well, people from higher socioeconomic status. Right? So wealthy individuals, wealthy families, wealthy kids are more likely to have in their social network people who do invention, who invent things, or scientists who do discoveries. And as a result of that correlation, that exposure, those individuals are much more likely to aspire to and then become inventors themselves. And so this sort of gels with this quote here from Stephen Jay Gould from the Pandas Thumb in 1980, which I'll read to you. I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolution of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. Right? So this is the idea of lost opportunity, the idea that there are lost Einsteins, or Marie Curies, if you prefer, who never get the chance to realize their potential because the scientific system is biased. It doesn't recognize the best people in a reliable way. Another recent paper looked at this thing they called the diversity innovation paradox in science, in which they looked at sort of the novelty of conceptual relationships and abstracts of PhD theses. And they found that innovativeness was higher for theses that were written by underrepresented minorities, women in many STEM fields, along with blacks and Hispanics, and et cetera, et cetera. And that those individuals, although their theses were more novel linguistically, their ideas had less impact later on in the overall literature in their fields. So diversity leads to innovation, but that then doesn't lead to impact. And so this is another example of the system itself being sort of biased against certain kinds of people, against certain kinds of ideas. But the point is that it's not reliably recognizing the innovativeness of these individuals' ideas. Okay, so you can call these social biases, that's sort of the term, but I would say that these social biases are just a kind of epistemic inefficiency. Right? So if we could remove the social biases from science to make it truly inclusive and meritocratic, right? Actually meritocratic, then we'd actually be improving the efficiency of science as well. We get more discoveries, and probably different discoveries too than we do right now. And so studying the social biases might allow us to get some insight into where these epistemic inefficiencies are in the system. So really, it's not meritocratic because merit is entangled with other social factors like prestige or privilege or identity. And so untangling those effects of those social biases can help make science better and more meritocratic. And importantly, we can study these epistemic inefficiencies scientifically. We can ask questions like, what's cause and effect here? Like, how does this structure in the system lead to an inefficiency in the system? How does it lead to a social bias in the system? And so today, I'm going to talk about 3 different aspects of this question. We're going to talk about who hires whose graduates as faculty, which is about scientific careers and jobs. We'll talk about what drives scientific productivity and prominence. We all have our heroes or people who are very famous in our fields. And the question is like, how much of their fame is really due to their inherent characteristics versus environmental characteristics or other things that are not inherent to them? And then a last question of how important is it who you work with or who you collaborate with in science? And we all have opinions about this, but we'll see what the data say when we get to it. All right, let's start with the first one, scientific careers. Who hires whose graduates as faculty? I would argue that in science, faculty are really special because they serve 2 unique purposes in society. One is that they produce new discoveries, right? We write papers, we come up with new theories, we do experiments, we make discoveries that advance science. But we also train new scientists, right? And so those two combinations, the combination of 2 functions is really special. Like there's not another group of people who do that because faculty are the ones who grant PhDs. PhD is the credential that you do research, blah, 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 right? So faculty have this special role. And I would say that faculty hiring, like who hires whose graduates as faculty, that's actually a network. And that looking at the shape of that network can tell us something about how ideas spread in academia, which we'll get to by the end of this section. On the right here, this is actual data for computer science from about a decade ago in terms of who hires whose graduates as faculty. And the size of the arrow tells you the volume of flow of PhD graduates from one institution to the other as faculty. So you can see that MIT is a big supplier, Carnegie Mellon and Stanford. But interestingly, right, MIT, my cursor, yeah, MIT here and Harvard here are just across the river from each other, but they have very different sort of outflows and inflows, right, in computer science. So there's lots of interesting structure here. All right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a census-level data set that we got from a company called Academic Analytics. If you have, for the faculty in the room, if you have ever gotten into upper administration, then you will know this company because they sell their product, which is their data, to universities. Provosts love this company because it gives them a dashboard that tells them, like, what are faculty doing at your institution? It's a census-level data for PhD granting institutions, essentially covering all departments, all PhD granting departments at all PhD granting universities in the American higher education system. So it's very close to a census. Here we're going to look at about 300,000 tenure track or tenured faculty in it, spanning 86 different fields. Physics is one of them, over a 10-year period. And we're going to ask just a couple of simple questions. How much does prestige matter in terms of who hires whose graduates as faculty? And what implication does that have on the spread of ideas? All right, so we're going to take this data, we're going to look at each institution, 387 institutions, and we're just going to ask how many current tenure track faculty called a particular institution their alma mater, right? They got their PhD from that place. So now we can sort them based on how many faculty each one produced. And what we find is that a very small number of institutions produce the vast majority of faculty. 8 institutions produce 20% of all faculty in the system. That's 20% of 300,000. 8 institutions have produced 60,000 professors. That's a lot of professors, right? And so here we're breaking things up by by quintiles, so 20% of faculty in each one of these bands. And so 8 institutions produce 20%. The next 20% is 12 institutions. It means 20 institutions produce 40% of all faculty, an enormous concentration, right? And then the bottom 20% is 308 institutions. That's the vast majority of institutions. Okay? So a hugely unequal production of faculty. Okay? Do you want to guess?
I would guess
you think somewhere in here?
Yeah.
For physics, maybe. For other fields, maybe down here, right? It depends on field, right?
Yeah.
But overall, I don't know where CU falls. It's not in the top 20.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't think it's certainly not in those first 2 bands. It's probably in this band right here.
I was thinking largely about physics.
Yeah, physics is a good department here, right? It's very well respected. But like our electrical engineering department is going to be over here in terms of production because they're not a highly ranked department. And so if you look at individual fields, then you will see things move around. This is just at the whole institution level. So let's look at fields and ask that same question. Oh, we see the same pattern. These are Lorentz curves. These tell you the fraction of institutions on the x-axis that produce the fraction of all faculty on the y-axis. What's kind of wild is that all of these curves suggest that there's a universal 80-20 rule, that 80% of faculty come from 20% of institutions. And that's true in all fields. Of course, which institutions are in that top 20% might vary a little bit. But in related analysis, we found that there's a high correlation across fields. Right? So an institution that is in the top 20% for one field is likely to be in the top 20% for other fields as well. And this isn't surprising. Like Harvard is really good in a lot of different fields. University of Michigan is really good in a lot of different fields. One thing that was surprising to me about this analysis is that top 8. Berkeley, Harvard, Michigan, Wisconsin, Stanford, Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, MIT, UT Austin. There's some good public schools in that group, right? It's not just the Ivies. The fact that Wisconsin and Michigan are in there, those are huge Midwest institutions, and they are some of the most producingest of faculty institutions in the country. Like, that's pretty cool, right? It's not just privates that are dominating. It's really something else. Something else is driving this, okay? So roughly a universal 80-20 rule, huge concentration in production of faculty. The prestige hierarchies here are really steep. Faculty placement is mostly down. 71% of graduates places faculty at institutions that are lower ranked than the ones that they got their PhD from. 18% move up. And only 20% of departments have trained more faculty than they've hired. Right? So it's a very, like there's a small number of exporters that supply faculty to essentially the entire system. And it's a reasonable question, like what would that mean for the spread of ideas, for epistemic efficiencies? How well are we exploring the boundaries of science if most faculty are coming from a small number of departments? I'll leave that up to you to decide. I have some opinions. We can look at the structure of these networks and we find that they have this sort of universal core periphery system. This is data just from computer science. The y-axis here is measuring how close a department is in this alumni network to all other departments. So a small value means that they're very central in that network. They're on the core. There's a small number of links between them and everybody else in the system. And a large value means you're on the periphery, right? So there's not many links from you to other places, or the paths from you to other places are very long and circuitous. And what we find is that there's this linear correlation between how close you are to the core and your prestige. So this actually suggests that it's not really a core and a periphery, it's more like homeland and colonies. Right? And here the colonial metaphor actually fits really well because those homeland institutions are really producing almost all of the faculty that then get jobs in the colonies. Right? And so, of course, they're taking their ideas with them as well. And so in some sense, that prestige becomes influence directly via faculty placement. Faculty are trained at one place. They learn about what ideas are interesting. They learn about norms in academia. And then they get placed. They get a job at some other place. And they take those norms and ideas with them. And so this creates a synchronousness, not a synchronicity, but a synchronization between the research agendas at the elite departments and the research that's being done everywhere else in the system. Now, that's not a value-laden statement. It might be efficient, in fact, to have this, to have a small number of departments exploring the boundaries and then exporting those ideas to a large number of institutions that will then follow up on that work or explore it further. That might be a very efficient organization, but that's an interesting question. What if we organize science differently? Could we change what discoveries get made? Would we explore different parts of the boundary? I don't know. But knowing that this is the structure of the system allows us to then entertain that counterfactual. Okay, so at the end of this section, I'm going to claim that prestige really is a structural variable in academia, in science. And it sort of governs a lot of the things that happen. In some sense, I like to joke, with apologies to biology, where this phrase really comes from, is that nothing in academia makes sense except in the light of prestige. This prestige, it reveals this core periphery structure of academia in which faculty and ideas and norms flow from the core out into the periphery. Only a modest fraction really stay in the core, and a tiny, tiny fraction flow upstream, go from a low-ranked place to a higher-ranked place. And these hierarchies are really stable over time, right? The top 10 departments or the top 20% of departments in physics have been the top 10 or top 20% for a long time with very little fluctuation over time, suggesting that there's a lot of inertia in the system and maybe some interesting effects, dynamics, that allow those institutions to maintain their positions in the system. So we can kind of sketch out this sort of causal diagram here in which prestige drives faculty production then drives the structure of the hierarchy, and maybe the hierarchy feeds back and drives prestige. We're going to revisit this later on because it'll become relevant again.
Maybe I have a brief question at this point. So
Yeah.
if you, I guess in this network, can you track, like, so if faculty, let's say, start at one place and then move up the network later on,
Yeah.
is this sort of one mechanism?
Yes, there are several mechanisms that reinforce the hierarchy. Both mid-career moves, as we call them, reinforce the hierarchy, but also leaving academia reinforces the hierarchy. So people that get their PhDs from low-ranked institutions are much more likely to leave academia regardless of where they get a faculty job at higher rates. And so that means that there are more faculty persisting who got their PhDs from elite places, which reinforces the hierarchy. That's one effect. There's another effect, as you said, about mid-career moves, in which there are people who tend to move further down the hierarchy in a mid-career move, and a small number of people who move back up, who sort of change the hierarchy as a result of their mid-career move. So most of the flow gets amplified downstream in some sense.
Can I just make sure I understood? So you're saying not just someone from a lower ranked institution has to get offered, but they're more likely once they're offered.
Indeed, all of this data is people who currently have faculty jobs. In fact, we don't get to see the people who wash out of the system in some sense, right? Who say, I applied for 5 jobs, I got no offers, and so I'm going and getting a job in industry. So those people are invisible to us because they're not current faculty. We're only looking at people who were successful in the lottery of getting a faculty job at all. And even there, we see that the ones who got their PhDs from relatively lower ranked places tend to leave at higher rates than the ones who get their PhDs from higher ranked places, even if they're at the same institution. Right? So 2 people at CU Boulder, one who got their PhD from, what's the top physics department? Quick. What's the second ranked? Okay, Berkeley, second ranked physics department at CU, and one from, say, University of New Mexico at CU. The one from University of New Mexico is more likely to leave their faculty job over time than the one from second ranked place, Berkeley. Right? Okay. All right. So I've teased you a little bit with this idea that science is not a meritocracy. I've shown you some data about faculty placement to show you that it's incredibly skewed in terms of where people come from. Let's now talk about what drives productivity and prominence, right? Scientific discourse is really dominated by a small number of scientists, and they all tend to be at the same institutions. And as we just saw, they all tend to have credentials or pedigree from the same kinds of places: Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Michigan, Wisconsin, et cetera. So there's this is hard to tease out, like, what's going on here. Like, why is it that those scientists are dominating the discourse? Because elite training leads to elite faculty job, and elite faculty job then leads to elite training, right? Once you have an elite faculty job, you train students, they're at elite place, they tend to get elite faculty jobs as well, right? So this creates this sort of endogenous cumulative advantage. You can't tell which of these 2 factors is really driving the productivity and prominence of individual scientists. And here, we're going to define productivity in a very crude way. We're just going to count publications. If you want to talk about the quality of publications, let's talk offline. I have a lot of opinions. about how to measure that. And prominence here is just like impact, citations, very crude measure. So again, not really thinking about like the character of the science, just thinking about the metrics of the science. So this endogenous cumulative advantage, it builds up this idea that we all sort of intuitively understand in academia, that past achievements correlate with future achievements. If you look at somebody who's really successful as a mid-career researcher, they've got a long history of being successful previously, right? And surely there are selection effects in there, which goes to whether or not they get a faculty job at all. But certainly the scientists who dominate the discourse tend to be at elite places and tend to come from elite places. So the question is, which of these two things is causing their dominance? Where they got trained or where they work. And so we're going to try to tease that apart. So,
You said this, and what does
endogenous means it's not driven by external things. We can't separate these. So there's some sort of feedback loop between these things. Okay, so there's two, as a cartoon, we can write down two possible explanations of this, which is it's either your training or where you work. Here's idea one, where a scientist trains. Pretty straightforward. This is the narrative we tell ourselves in the meritocracy, that it's your skill, your talent, your training, your temperament, right? And that faculty hiring sorts people by their natural potential for good outcomes. That faculty hiring in the market will select the best people and place them at the best places. And by implication, people who get low-ranked faculty jobs are somehow lesser as an individual, lesser of a scientist, and so on. They have less potential for outcomes, right? So the market is sorting people based on their inherent characteristics. And so the most productive scientists will have this elite pedigree because they have that amazing training, right? So where you train is going to cause your future productivity and prominence. Or, as the other side of the cartoon, it's where you work. It has nothing to do with where you trained. It's all to do with environmental factors and resources and collaborators at your institution or support. So beyond a basic training, this hypothesis says that your output is driven by your local environment, right? So moving from a poor environment to a rich environment should improve your output in some sense, or moving from a rich environment to a poor environment should decrease your output, because your output is not necessarily a function of your characteristics, but is more a function of your environment's characteristics. So where you work causes your future productivity and prominence. All right, so we're going to test this using data here from computer science, from my field. We got 2,500 early career computer science hires. We then went and got their 200,000 publications and about 7.4 million citations in order to measure their productivity and prominence. And we're going to use a technique here from causal inference called matched pairs. And the idea is to try to create synthetic sort of control and treatment individuals. So we want two individuals that look as identical as possible prior to the treatment event, which is going to be job placement. And then we ask, so the treatment is going to be different. One's going to go to a high-ranked place, one to a low-ranked place. Then we're going to ask, conditioned on that one variation and what happens to them once they're downstream trajectory under these two models, or these two measures, publications and citations. So we're going to match on a bunch of things in the training environment. So we want them to have a PhD from similar places, so like 2 students from Yale, working in a similar subfield, similar number of papers prior to their faculty placement, similar status in terms of doing a postdoc or not. We're going to control for gender as well. So control for as many of these variables as we can. And then we're going to ask, condition on one going to a higher ranked place than the other one, what does their downstream trajectory look like? So we're going to measure this using publications, yearly difference in publications, and yearly difference in citations. In the matched pair analysis, if we've done our matching correctly, the difference in these values prior to the treatment should be 0. And so what I'm showing you here is that, indeed, we did a pretty good job finding these synthetic twins in the data, people who look like they're identical up to the point of treatment, and then we can look at what happens downstream. Okay? And so these are faculty pairs who are matched on similar training but who have different placement. So this is a measure of the effect of the environment, because we're controlling for those inherent characteristics of where you were trained. What we find is that they have different productivity and prominence downstream, suggesting that it's not where you trained that produces your productivity and prominence, but rather where you work.
Maybe that both remove one.
In this case, we're controlling for the training environment.
What I mean by remove one. If
Yeah.
you controlled for one thing, both make a difference, but the one that you make the same one.
we did the other experiment too, where we take two people who train at different places who then place at the same place. What we find there is that there's not much difference in their behavior downstream. But that analysis has a problem. There's something called a collider effect, because we're choosing the match. This is really technical, sorry. We're choosing the matched pairs based on a characteristic of the treatment itself. And so from a causal inference perspective, this introduces the possibility that we are eliminating the effect we're trying to measure. In our case, the fact that we get a signal from this side and not from the other side, in which people with different training go to the same place and we see that they behave the same, it's circumstantial evidence that the hypothesis is right. But this is really the stronger analysis, because here we're controlling for the environment here and then looking at what happens downstream. Anyway, so the conclusion here is that we find this evidence to suggest that it really is where you work that drives your productivity and prominence. We did a bunch of other tests to eliminate alternative hypotheses, which you can read about in the paper if you want. But the conclusion holds up. And so what we find here is that the working environment, not the training environment, really is what appears to drive the volume of your contribution. So those elite environments, like the Harvards and the Berkeleys and the MITs and the Michigans and the Wisconsins, there's something special about those environments that produce a lot of scientific contributions and that accrete a lot of scientific attention. And so why do elite institutions dominate science? Well, doctoral prestige drives faculty location, as we saw previously, but faculty location then drives scholarly impact. So usually we just say, oh, doctoral prestige drives scholarly impact, but there's a mediating variable in between, which is this environmental mechanism, which is kind of cool. In a paper we published last year, we wanted to find out, like, well, why is it that scientists working at elite institutions write so many more papers? And it turns out that it's just a labor advantage. They have larger research groups. And there's a really clear correlation in the data to show that if you're at MIT in computer science, your research group is much larger than if you're a computer scientist, say, at CU, because MIT is highly ranked, et cetera. And this is not too surprising, because we also know that these elite institutions receive much more federal funding. And federal funding in the sciences is largely used to fund labor, right? Graduate students and postdocs. And so the circumstantial evidence here supports this conclusion that the advantage, the environmental mechanism that these elite institutions have is really a volume advantage, in the sense that they have more people who are just writing the papers. And that's why they're dominating the science. So this now raises an interesting counterfactual. Could we produce more or different science by reallocating the labor? If we took some of those graduate students at MIT, which is very rich in that way, and moved them to a lower ranked institution, like say CSU up the road, would we get different science or more science? Our paper from last year suggests you would not get more science, because we find that graduate students write the same number of papers per year no matter where they are. So MIT graduate students are not inherently more productive than Colorado graduate students or CSU graduate students or Michigan graduate students. There's just more of them at MIT and Michigan and Wisconsin. That's right. And so now we're talking about quality and things like that, right? So the volume of scientific contributions would not change, but maybe you would get different scientific contributions, right? Maybe they'd be worse. Maybe they'd be better. I don't know. It's an interesting question. And now that we see the patterns in the data, we can ask these questions and try to find out the answer. OK. Last section. How important is it who you work with? So I talked about networks earlier in terms of faculty placement, but those are like institutional networks. But we all exist inside social networks, right? We have collaborators we work with. We have our PhD advisor, our postdoc advisor. We have students we work with, right? These social networks are really key, because they mediate so much of actual science, right? They mediate the training, the hiring, the collaboration, the teaching, the attention that different scientific discoveries or contributions get are mediated by our networks. Any of you who are on social media understand that who you follow shapes which papers you read. And you probably follow specific people in order to get access or become aware of certain kinds of papers. Maybe you follow an aggregator from the archive or something like that so that you can be aware of the new papers that are written by certain individuals. Or maybe you follow specific famous people because you really like their work, right? So networks mediate our attention in science. And as a result, they're going to mediate a lot of other things when they mediate our attention, including things like peer review. And so the claim here is that networks are going to act like a kind of unequally distributed capital right? So there are better and worse networks in this sense. Like if you're central in the network, the social network here, then you will receive information faster than if you're on the periphery of that network. And I'm going to argue and show you some evidence that that's the case. So let's untangle this idea. Why is your social network so important to your productivity and prominence? Well, if you, in STEM fields where there's a collaboration norm, if you have a productive collaborator, then your productivity increases because you co-author with them, right? If they write a lot of papers and you can co-author with them, then your productivity looks like it's higher because your name's on those papers. And similarly, if you have a very prominent collaborator who receives many citations, well, you're collaborating with them, and so your papers will also receive citations, right? So having a prominent collaborator will enhance your productivity and prominence. Having a productive collaborator will enhance your productivity and prominence. And so this implies, in fact, that productivity and prominence are not individual characteristics. I can't measure your productivity or your prominence independent of your collaborators' contributions to your productivity and your prominence, which, when we're being honest about how science works, like, yes, right? Like, science is a team effort. Like, my productivity, the papers that I've written depend very critically on my students. Right? They're fantastic researchers. They've done a huge amount of work, and I benefit from working with them, and they benefit from working with me. And so it's sort of obvious that like the social network should be important, but in what ways is it important? How important is it? We have to untangle these effects, these network effects, in order to see what individuals' productivity and prominence really is. So we're going to try to untangle that using some models. We're going to use probability models here because my background is in Bayesian modeling and generative models and networks, and it's really fun. And so we're going to take this idea of productivity and prominence being a pairwise feature, and we're going to try to use those pairwise labels to then infer what the individual labels, the individual characteristics should be. So let's take this as a sort of a cartoon. I've got 3 individuals, and they've written papers together in pairs. And so I can count how many papers each pair has produced, right? I just count the co-authorships between that pair. This is exactly a collaboration network. So for the first model for productivity, I'm just going to model the productivity of the pair as a linear function of their unknown latent productivities. So we're going to find the latent productivity of an individual I as just some unknown parameter lambda I. Okay? And J is collaborator is going to be lambda J. And so their joint parameter, their joint productivity is just the sum of their individual productivities. So if mine is like 0.5 and Andy's is 0.5, then our collaboration together is going to have a 1. Right? And so then we're just going to model this as a really simple Poisson model. Right? And so the average production in a given period of time is just going to be the sum of our productivities for that period of time. Okay? Very straightforward. Right? And then to do the prominence, we're going to take something similar, but we're now going to have to define and measure a prominence. And here, we're going to look at the number of highly cited papers. We have a particular definition of what that means. It has to be in the top, I think it's like 8% of cited papers within a field in a given year. And then we're going to say, like, that's a highly cited paper, and everything else is not highly cited. So we're going to dichotomize all papers in a given field in a given year and say some are yeses and some are nos. And now we want to know what's the probability that a given pair is going to produce one of these highly cited papers, a prominent paper. And here again, we're just going to model it as a linear function of the latent prominences of the 2 individuals. But now we're not going to use a Poisson model, we're going to use a binomial model because we're just counting the number of prominent papers. So the number of prominent papers in IJ is just parameterized by the sum of those prominences of those individuals. I'm going to skip over the technical details of how we estimate this model from the network. There's a lot of linear optimization, along with some pruning to deal with some non-identifiability. But the point is that we can apply this model at scale to a network of hundreds of thousands of scientists looking at the bibliometric measures, and we can estimate their latent parameters by sort of netting out the network effects. All right, so here's the data we're going to apply it to. This data set called the Microsoft Academic Graph. It spans 70 years of time. We're going to select out of it, for certain reasons, which I'll skip over going into, about 200,000 mid-career researchers. This is largely to ensure there's enough data to estimate these latent parameters. So they have to have 10 papers by the 15th year of publishing. So not too high a bar for productivity. We're going to look at 6 different fields in STEM. We're focusing on STEM because there you have these collaboration norms in which people write papers with each other and they co-author. If you look at a field like anthropology or some parts of political science, even economics, solo author papers are the norm. And so this model falls apart completely, right? Collaboration isn't a norm in those fields, and so you can't really think about your productivity being a function of your collaborators' productivities because you don't have collaborators. We're going to focus only on the first and last author pairs because that sort of controls for all these middle authors, right? So, the gigantic like neutrino experiments with 500 authors, we're just going to look at the first one and the last one. And so all those middle authors, I know, sorry, middle authors.
Well, also it's like AAB and
Right.
ZY.
Yeah. It turns out that there are not a lot of papers that have 500 co-authors on them, so it's a tiny fraction of the data set. They are very special papers, but in this case, we're not looking at those special papers. That's not the research question we're interested in. We're more interested in sort of the aggregates. And so we're not too worried about dropping them. And then we're going to estimate these individual parameters, these lambda i's and theta i's, for each of these scientists. And we're going to look at them over time as well because that's relevant. We're going to then investigate how these things covary with some other things. Like we're going to look at gender and prestige and so on. OK. So
Actually, wait, one question on the model setup. So for first
this
class
model
author-
setup?
Well, the next one.
OK.
So on the first class author pairs, I
Yeah.
guess I'm trying to think, like for me, usually if I'm last author, one of my grad students is first author. So this is basically this going to essentially measure how well I played.
Not necessarily place them because we're not looking at faculty hiring here. We're looking at number of papers and how prominent the papers are. And so yes, a lot of the pairs in this data set are going to be advisors and advisees because that's what faculty do. We train new scientists, and so most of our collaborators are going to be students over time. But that's not always true, right? We also have some collaborators that are outside of our groups. They might be a small fraction, but nevertheless, we're still going to be looking at this. And you'll see prestige will show up, but we'll also look at senior, junior co-authors as well. OK.
Well, I guess I asked this because I could see that if I'm a middle author with one of my colleagues is a middle author, that's more.
Yeah, you could look at that. We dropped the middle authors because middle authorship is a more ambiguous signal of collaboration. Right, so first and last author pairs are much more often in the norms in the fields that we're looking at, much more often, senior author who, raised the money and conceived the research idea or whatever, and then the first author is the student who did that work for the most part. But what's interesting is that you might imagine that the network is just a bunch of disconnected components, right? A bunch of advisors and a star of advisees around them. But in fact, the network is connected. And so there are lots of first and last author collaborations that happen across research groups. For instance, you were once a first author with your advisor as a senior author, right? And so that links together your research groups. Yeah.
I was just going to mention, going along with this, that there are a lot of subfield effects about authorship.
Yep.
So I come from high energy theory,
Yep.
where it's an alphabetical.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
usually, and there's no huge list. There's maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 authors, and that's alphabetical. So you shouldn't even include those.
Absolutely. The same thing is true for theoretical computer science, for instance, which is more like pure math, in which authors are listed alphabetically. So we include, I'm sure we include some subfields that have that we're not aware of. We did take out the ones that we knew of. But including those subfields would just lower the effect size that we see because, as you said, they're noise, right? So in some sense, we're being conservative by including them. We might be missing some signals that are there, but we're not going to see things that aren't there as a result of including those things because author order is alphabetical. OK, so let's just do some model checking to make sure that this thing kind of works in a reasonable way. We're going to apply it to these 200,000 STEM researchers, the mid-career researchers. These are people who have, what is the number? 15 years of publishing history, so 15 years post first paper. So that's definitely mid-career, not PhD students, probably, hopefully. Probably not assistant professors, hopefully, unless maybe in physics. How many postdocs is normal now? OK. Yeah, so there might be a few postdocs in this, but mostly faculty. OK, so if we just look at the joint distribution of the two parameters, the productivity and the prominence, what we find is that productivity is pretty well concentrated, which is reasonable, right? Your latent ability to write papers is not a high variance distribution, right? There's not people who can write 5 times as many papers solo as you. Maybe 20% more, maybe 20% less, but for the most part, as I alluded to earlier, graduate students everywhere write roughly the same number of papers per year, regardless of where they are. Faculty are kind of the same way, right? If you look at their latent productivity, it's well concentrated. There's not a lot of variation there. But prominence is hugely asymmetric, hugely skewed. And this follows along with a lot of the literature we see in terms of citation distributions and so on, that we see these high variance things in prominence, but not necessarily in productivity. Okay, so this is a good sanity check. We can go one step further. Oh yeah, average is half a paper per year, which honestly, as a full professor, that seems about right. That's about how many papers I can write a year by myself. It's half a paper a year. The uncorrected counts, absolutely. But these are counts that are corrected for the network effects. So here we're trying to net out the contributions of your collaborators. So it's certainly true that, for instance, in machine learning, my colleagues in computer science across campus, they write 15 or 20 papers a year, which is mind-blowing. But they also have 15 or 20 graduate students. And so that's how they're able to achieve that productivity. But if you were working alone, you would see much less variation in productivity because you only have a certain number of hours in a day. And so even there, yes, there are going to be variations. If you're an experimentalist, your papers will take longer because you have to get the experiment to work, and that's a lot of work. Whereas if you're a theorist, you write down a model, you derive something, it's less work, maybe. Sorry, theorists. Go spend some time in a wet lab. So like, you know, there might be some variation, but you're not going to see a factor of 5, right? But if you include the unadjusted counts of productivity, you do see factors of 5, right? There are these insane people who publish 100 papers a year. And how do they do it? They have a small empire that they are the leader of, right? And that's how they do it. They have many, many people working under them. But them alone, right, half a paper per year is the average. Of course, there's some fluctuation. Okay. All right, so let's check these latent parameters by checking how they correlate with things that we expect them to correlate with. Here's just this big correlation matrix. So we ask prestige in institution, paper citations, and there are 2 latent parameters, and then high lambda co-authors and high prominence, high productivity co-authors, high prominence co-authors. And for the papers and citations, what we find is that they correlate really well with having these high lambda co-authors, and prominence correlates really well with having high theta co-authors. So this is in some sense a soft validation of the claim I made earlier that your collaborators in some sense drive your productivity and prominence. So who you work with really matters in this sense. Okay, so let's dig in a bit more. Let's now look at some of the covariates. So because we have the names of the individuals, we can do a reasonable job at labeling them as being men or women. We're just going to use the binary labels here because that's what you can do algorithmically. Yeah. Yep. You should write that paper and tell me. I don't know. So we played around with a bunch of different versions of the model, and because I have some history of being a physicist, I really like linear models. It also made the equations much easier to work with in terms of the maximum likelihood estimators. You could imagine writing down some nonlinearities, and they might be a better fit to the data. But there's a large space of nonlinear properties you might insert into these functions, and we have not explored it. And so if you are interested in exploring it, let me know the answer. OK, so we're going to take all this bibliographic database. We're going to label all the names as being men or women based on how gendered their name is culturally, which is a sort of standard algorithmic approach. It's not perfect. It does allow us to, in some sense, measure some signal here. Now, historically, there's been a lot of literature looking at the productivity of men and women in science. It's like 80 years of people studying this question. And that literature points sort of universally to this idea that women write fewer papers than men. And they receive fewer citations than men. And there's been a lot of ink spilled, sort of gnashing the teeth about the inequities here, the inequalities here, what does it mean for sexism in science, right? All very important things. But there's still this question of, well, if productivity and prominence are network effects, we can't look at men and women directly. We have to control for their collaboration networks. So if their collaboration networks are different, that might be why we see differences in productivity that are gendered. So now we can do that. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at year on the x-axis, publications by 15th year on the y here, citations by 15th year on the y here. These just show you the unadjusted counts. You can see clearly that there's a gendered effect here. Men publish more papers, men receive more citations than women. And those numbers are all going up, but the gap is sort of staying fairly constant. Okay, so this is the classic result, that women receive less attention for their research and that they write fewer papers. And there's lots of papers that have been written about why this is. There's lots of mechanisms. I've written papers in this space, right? But if we look at the latent parameters, something interesting emerges, right? That gap goes away, even as the trend is going up, right? So this is telling us something really interesting. It's saying that first of all, this method is able to infer these latent things, and it's suggesting to us that men and women are not inherently different in terms of their productivity or their prominence, but rather the difference is in their networks, right? That's really interesting. It's not a causal explanation, but it does suggest a hypothesis that there's something about the way men build collaboration networks that drives their greater productivity or that drives their greater prominence. Or maybe they don't build the networks, maybe they're given to them, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay? Right. In fact, let's talk about that right now. So how much does your early career collaboration really influence your downstream productivity and prominence? How important is it to have an elite researcher as an early career collaborator? Because we have people labeled with their latent productivities and prominences, and we know when they started publishing, we can establish this. We can look at pairs in which you have a junior co-author and an elite senior co-author who has a high productivity or high prominence. And we can ask what happens to that junior co-author downstream. Okay? And what we find is that it's really important. So having a highly productive co-author early in your career or a highly prominent co-author early in your career substantially increases the likelihood that you are highly prominent in your mid-career. It's really common at elite institutions. And the effect also appears at non-elite institutions too, suggesting that it's not driven by the prestige of the institution, it's driven by the individual. And there are elite researchers at non-elite institutions. There are just fewer of them, right? We find that the benefits of having this early career co-author decrease with the age of the senior co-author. This is also really interesting. Again, not causal, but generative hypotheses. Like, why is it the case that the older your elite co-author is, as a junior researcher, the less benefit you get from their network?
So this means that you could work with young faculty?
Highly productive, highly prominent young faculty, right? Because then you get more of a boost. And we can imagine causal explanations here that are very compelling, which is that younger or mid-career elite co-author will be around long enough that you can benefit from them and their network for many years. Whereas at the very end of the career, there's a limited horizon in which that benefit can still help you, right? And so this is a hypothesis. Right? We should write a paper to figure out, like, is this actually what's happening? But the correlation is really clear, right? That social networks are in some sense heritable in academia. If you collaborate with an elite researcher early in your career, that rubs off on you. And we can see that effect later in your career because that made you more productive or more prominent. And this makes sense, right? When I was a PhD student, I was in a non-elite institution. I worked with my advisor. He introduced me to his best friend. We wrote a lot of papers together. His best friend was an incredibly prominent researcher. Some of you may have seen his talk last year, Mark Newman, right? And so I wrote a bunch of papers with Mark Newman as a result of my PhD advisor's social network. And I still write papers with Mark Newman occasionally. So that's clearly an inherited connection that I got purely because of that senior-junior co-authorship relationship early in my career. So that's an example of how this effect works. And all of us can think about that, right? Those of us who have been around in academia long enough, we can point to these examples of senior co-authors not getting passed around, but it just happens from the collaborations, right? You work on the topic, you meet somebody, you're like, okay, let's write a paper together, and then now that's your co-author. It's exactly how science works. But this creates these network effects that look like unequally distributed social capital. right? Your network of collaborators is a kind of social capital for doing science. And of course it's unequally distributed because we have to construct it and maintain it and so on. But it has effects on careers, which is very interesting. Okay, so the claim is that networks act like this kind of unequally distributed social capital. They mediate our scientific attention, evaluation, and collaboration. As a result, they drive our productivity and prominence in these very interesting ways. The differences in collaboration networks can explain some really interesting patterns that people have been arguing about for many decades, including gender differences in productivity and prominence, right? So we found no difference in the latent productivity of men and women scientists mid-career, even though men do publish more and are more prominent. So this kind of implies that it's the differences in the networks. And there's lots of things that affect how the network evolves over time. So for instance, I wrote a paper on the impact of parenthood on scientists a few years ago, showing that women experience a much larger drop in productivity after becoming parents as academics than men do. Not a new discovery, but we had a causal inference structure so we could actually pin down exactly how large the effect was. It's substantial. And so this suggests that the mechanism for how that works could be mediated by the network itself, right? The loss of co-authors as a result of this change in the way you allocate your time for a woman as opposed to a man, okay? So this means that we should not really compare these unadjusted measures of productivity and prominence. So when you're evaluating a tenure case or evaluating a faculty candidate or considering a graduate student to hire as a PhD student or whatever, right, you're evaluating not just their record, but their collaborator's record as well. And so it then becomes clear that it is not fair to take two CVs and compare them side by side, even if they're the same age, because you're really comparing their networks to each other. So this suggests that there is a way that you might be able to sort of net out the effect of those differences in the network, but you have to think about it. You have to work a little bit harder to do it. Okay. We also find this early career productivity and prominence, that these elite senior co-authors really sort of bequeath some of their network to their junior co-authors as a kind of like an intergenerational transfer of wealth in some sense, which is kind of a neat analog with an economic idea. And that this effect is independent of institutional prestige. It's just that there's more elite senior co-authors at elite institutions. Right? They're concentrated up there. Okay? So what else might correlate with the network? We don't know, but this framework sort of reveals that there's possibly a lot of things that you could do with trying to net out these collaboration network effects to figure out what's going on. But it also suggests this really interesting hypothesis, which is, can we intervene in the networks as a result of these insights to change them? Could we fund new collaborations, for instance, after parenthood? Could we create early career fellowships to work with elite senior co-authors? That could make a bridge in the network that didn't exist before and maybe change the kind of science that gets done. Okay, so to wrap up, I know we're at the end of the time. Prestige is really this sort of structural variable in science. Where you work really matters. Who you work with really matters. And I think we undervalue those environmental and network effects when we think about the meritocracy. Because the meritocracy is this sort of physics ideal of these particles in a vacuum. But it's not that way at all. It's not how science works. So can we accelerate science? Yes, I think we can. If we deprioritize prestige signals, if we deconcentrate academic labor, and maybe we use targeted collaboration support to really accelerate things that are being inhibited by the current sort of inefficiencies in the system. All right, so here's a reference to the papers. Thanks to a whole cast of people who were lead authors on these papers, and I'll take questions now. Thanks. And sorry for going right up until the hour. Yeah. 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 We're very interested in that process. The peer review literature is really big and really old. Lots and lots of people are trying to think about how to make it better, for instance. And there's been a fair amount of work trying to understand how does prestige and gender and so on influence peer review. The answer is yes to all of those, it does. But also different models of peer review. Like computer science is a totally different model for peer review than most other fields does and so on. So yeah, trying to untangle those things I think is a key part of it. But peer review is just a piece of the whole system, right? Like the way faculty hiring works and the way even graduate admissions works, like these are all pieces of the system. And in some sense, it's an ecosystem of possibilities. And peer review is like one part over here. Other questions? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say it's not that I'm missing that. It's rather that that's a hypothesis, first of all. Thomas Kuhn, who is the person who gave us the concept of paradigm shifts, would have a lot to say about that. That you're saying that the paradigm shifts are where all the advances come from, and that normal science is sort of